Why did my SIL keep accidentally endangering my newborn? My sister-in-law Bridget couldn't have children, and when I got pregnant, she lost her mind. She'd been trying for 7 years while I got pregnant 3 months after getting married to her brother. She pretended to be supportive, but I could see the hatred in her eyes every time she looked at my belly. Some people get everything so easily, she'd say to anyone who'd listen. Must be nice to not even have to try. When my daughter Lily was born, Bridget immediately declared herself the most important aunt. I'm going to be her second mother, she announced at the hospital. Since I can't have my own, I'll pour all my love into this baby. Everyone thought it was sweet. I thought it was creepy. She started coming over every single day. She'd snatch Lily out of my arms the second she arrived. Mommy needs a break, she'd say, even when I'd just woken up from a full night's sleep. When I'd try to take my baby back, she'd hold on tighter. Don't be selfish. Lily needs to bond with her aunt too. Then the accident started. First, she gave Lily water when she was only 3 weeks old. I caught her with a bottle of water at Lily's lips. Babies get thirsty too, she said when I screamed. When I explained that water could kill a newborn, she rolled her eyes. That's just paranoid internet nonsense. Babies in my generation drank water and survived. Next, she put thick blankets and stuffed animals in Lily's crib during her nap. I found my baby's face pressed against a teddy bear, barely able to breathe. Bridget said she was just trying to make the crib cozy. You keep her in that cold, empty box like she's in prison. When I showed her the safe sleep guidelines, she said modern mothers were too anxious about everything. She'd leave Lily on the changing table and walk away to get things. She'd prop bottles in Lily's mouth and leave her alone to feed. She'd put Lily in her car seat but not buckle the straps properly. Every time I caught her, she'd say I was overreacting. I've babysat dozens of kids. I know what I'm doing. My husband Keith didn't see the pattern. She's trying to help. She's just not up to date on current safety stuff. Be patient with her. His parents said the same thing. Bridget loves that baby. She'd never hurt her. You're being a paranoid new mother. The breaking point came when Lily was 2 months old. I had to use the bathroom and left Lily with Bridget for literally 3 minutes. When I came back, Bridget was feeding Lily honey from a spoon. Actual honey. To a 2-month-old baby. It's good for her immune system, Bridget said as I knocked the spoon away. Plus, it'll help her sleep better. I rushed Lily to the emergency room. Infant botulism from honey can be fatal. The doctor was horrified when I told him what happened. We had to stay for observation while they monitored Lily for symptoms. Bridget told everyone I was being dramatic about a tiny bit of honey. When we got home from the hospital, I banned Bridget from our house. She showed up anyway the next day with Keith's parents. This has gone too far, my mother-in-law said. You're keeping Bridget from her niece over accidents. She's devastated. They staged an actual intervention about my paranoid behavior. Keith sat there letting them attack me while our baby slept upstairs. Maybe you have postpartum anxiety, Bridget suggested with fake concern. It makes mothers see danger everywhere. That's when we heard a crash from upstairs. Everyone ran to the nursery. Bridget had gone up there while they were lecturing me. She'd taken Lily out of her crib and put her on the window seat to take photos. The crash was Lily rolling off onto the floor. My 2-month-old baby was on the floor screaming. But that wasn't the worst part. The window was wide open. The window seat was pushed right against it. If Lily had rolled the other direction, she would have fallen 2 stories onto concrete. Bridget stood there with her phone still in camera mode. I just wanted some photos with natural light, she said. Babies are tougher than you think. I called 911 while Keith finally lost it on his sister. The paramedics showed up faster than I expected, rushing through our front door with their equipment bags bouncing against their legs. I was on the floor with Lily pressed against my chest, tears streaming down my face while her screams filled the room. Keith stood over Bridget near the window, his face completely red, his hands shaking as he yelled at her about what the hell she was thinking. One of the paramedics, a woman with short gray hair, knelt down next to me and gently asked if she could check Lily. I didn't want to let go, but I forced myself to hand her over, watching every movement as the paramedic laid my baby on the carpet and started examining her. The other paramedic, a younger guy, asked Keith what happened, and Keith pointed at Bridget, his voice cracking as he explained about the window seat and the open window. Bridget stood there holding her phone, still in camera mode, and kept saying she just wanted photos with natural light. Keith turned back to her and screamed that she could have killed his daughter, that Lily could have fallen 2 stories onto concrete, and Bridget actually rolled her eyes and said babies are tougher than people think. The gray-haired paramedic was feeling the bump on Lily's head while Lily cried, and she looked up at her partner with this serious expression that made my stomach drop. She told me the bump was concerning, but that Lily being alert and crying was actually a good sign. Her partner asked how far Lily fell, and I explained about the window seat height, maybe 2 feet onto carpet. But then I pointed at the open window right next to where she landed. Both paramedics looked at each other, and the guy asked if the window was open when Lily was placed there. Keith answered yes, his voice breaking, and explained that his sister put Lily there for photos. The female paramedic very carefully picked Lily up and handed her back to me, then said we needed to take her to the emergency room right away. She explained that head injuries in babies can be really serious even when they seem okay at first, and they needed a doctor to check for internal problems. The male paramedic was writing notes on a clipboard and asked again about the open window, and when I confirmed it, He and his partner shared another one of those concerned looks that made me feel sick. Keith's parents were still standing in the nursery doorway, and his mother started saying that Lily only fell a short distance onto soft carpet and seemed totally fine. His father added that babies fall all the time, and we didn't need to panic over a little bump. I stood up with Lily clutched against my chest and told them to get out of my house right now. Keith's mother looked shocked and started to argue, but I cut her off and said they came here to lecture me about being paranoid, and then Bridget nearly killed my baby while they distracted me. Keith's father said I was being dramatic, and that Bridget made a mistake. Keith finally turned away from Bridget and told his parents they needed to leave immediately. His mother tried to touch his arm, but he stepped back and said they defended someone who kept endangering his daughter, and he was done listening to them. His voice was shaking but firm when he said they needed to go now and not come back until he said they could. Keith's mother started crying and his father's face got red, but Keith walked over and physically guided them toward the stairs. Bridget tried to follow them, but Keith blocked her path and told her she was never setting foot in his house again. She started crying too, saying she'd never hurt her niece and we were being so cruel to her. The paramedics were packing up their equipment and the female one touched my shoulder gently and said we should follow them to the hospital in our car. The emergency room was freezing cold and way too bright, making everything feel even more awful than it already was. A nurse took us straight back to a room instead of making us wait, which scared me because it meant they thought this was serious. Keith held Lily while I gave the nurse information, my hands shaking so hard I could barely sign the forms. A doctor came in about 10 minutes later, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, who introduced herself as Elena Richardson. She washed her hands at the sink, and then asked Keith to lay Lily on the exam table. She examined the bump on Lily's head really carefully, shining a light in her eyes and watching how she moved. Then she asked me to explain exactly what happened, and I started describing how Bridget took Lily upstairs during their intervention. Elena listened while checking Lily's reflexes, nodding but not interrupting. When I got to the part about the open window right next to where Lily landed, Elena stopped what she was doing and looked right at me. She asked if this was the first dangerous incident involving this person, and I felt something break inside me. I told her no, that there had been multiple incidents over the past 2 months. I listed them quickly, trying not to cry. The water at 3 weeks, the unsafe sleep setup, the honey that brought us here before, the improper car seat buckles. Elena's expression changed from concerned to something harder, more serious. She finished examining Lily and then sat down on the rolling stool and said she needed to involve a social worker in this case. The social worker showed up about 20 minutes later, a man in his 40s wearing khakis and a button-down shirt who introduced himself as Cormac Richardson. He pulled up a chair and opened a laptop, then asked Keith and me to walk him through everything that had happened since Lily was born. I started with Bridget's declaration at the hospital about being a second mother, then moved through each dangerous incident. Keith sat next to me holding Lily, and I could feel him getting more tense as I talked. I described the water bottle at Lily's lips when she was 3 weeks old, and how Bridget dismissed my panic as internet nonsense. I explained finding Lily's face pressed against a teddy bear, barely breathing, and Bridget saying I kept her in a cold prison. I told him about the honey incident and how we'd been here before for observation. Cormac typed everything I said, his face getting more and more concerned. I described today how Bridget went upstairs during their intervention and took Lily out of her crib for photos. My voice cracked when I described the open window and how close Lily came to rolling the other direction. Cormac stopped typing and looked at both of us, then asked a question that made Keith flinch. He wanted to know if Bridget had any mental health history or obsessive behaviors we knew about. Keith shifted Lily in his arms and his voice was quiet when he answered. He explained that Bridget had been trying to have a baby for 7 years with multiple failed treatments and several miscarriages. He said she'd struggled with the infertility but seemed to be coping until I got pregnant so quickly. Cormac asked if Bridget had been in therapy for the infertility issues, and Keith admitted he didn't know. Cormac typed more notes and then said something that made my chest tight. He explained that what I was describing sounded like something beyond accidents or just not knowing current safety guidelines. He said the pattern suggested someone who was either deliberately creating dangerous situations or was so obsessed with the baby that she couldn't recognize the risks she was creating. He asked if we'd documented any of these incidents, and I told him about the hospital records from the honey incident. Cormac nodded and said he was going to recommend that the hospital keep Lily overnight for observation, both for medical reasons and to give them time to properly document the situation. Keith asked what would happen next, and Cormac explained that he'd be filing a report about the pattern of endangerment, and that we'd need to take steps to protect Lily from further contact with Bridget. Elena came back in and confirmed that she wanted to keep Lily overnight to watch for any delayed symptoms from the head injury. She said babies can seem fine after a fall but then develop problems hours later. A nurse showed us to a room in the pediatric unit, a small space with a crib and a chair that pulled out into an uncomfortable bed. Keith and I took turns holding Lily while she slept, neither of us willing to put her down even though the nurses said she'd be safe in the crib. Around midnight, Keith started apologizing. He said he was so sorry for not listening to me sooner, for dismissing my concerns as paranoid new mother anxiety. His voice broke when he said he should have protected us both from his family. I didn't know what to say because part of me was still angry that it took something this extreme for him to finally believe me. But another part of me was just relieved that he finally saw what I'd been seeing for months. I told him we'd figure it out together, and he nodded, tears running down his face as he held our sleeping daughter. Keith's phone started going crazy around 1 in the morning, buzzing constantly with messages. He pulled it out and his face went pale as he scrolled through them. His mother sent multiple texts saying we were overreacting and that Bridget was devastated. His father sent messages accusing us of being cruel and saying families work through accidents together. Bridget herself sent a long text about how much she loved Lily and how she'd never deliberately hurt her niece. There were messages from other family members too, people his parents must have called to get on their side. Keith's aunt said we were tearing the family apart. His cousin asked why we were being so harsh over an accident. His mother sent another text saying I was being cruel to Bridget, who just loved Lily so much. Keith stared at his phone for a long time, and then did something I didn't expect. He turned it completely off and put it in his pocket. He looked at me and said his family could wait, that the only people who mattered right now were me and Lily. It was the first time since this whole thing started that I felt like he was really choosing us over them. Elena came to check on Lily early the next morning, examining her carefully and asking me questions about how she'd been overnight. I explained that Lily had eaten normally and didn't seem to be in pain. Elena listened to her heart and checked her reflexes again, then said she was comfortable discharging us. She sat down and looked at both Keith and me with this very serious expression. She said that based on what we'd told them and what the social worker documented, she was making a strong recommendation that we prevent any unsupervised contact with the person who caused these incidents. She didn't use Bridget's name, but it was completely clear who she meant. Elena explained that the pattern we described wasn't normal, and that our daughter's safety had to be our top priority. She said if there were any more incidents, the hospital would be required to report it to Child Protective Services, because repeated endangerment could be considered neglect on our part if we kept allowing access. Keith asked what we should do, and Elena said we needed to set firm boundaries and stick to them no matter what family pressure we faced. She handed us discharge papers with instructions about symptoms to watch for and a follow-up appointment for next week. We pulled into our driveway around 10 in the morning, and I felt exhausted in a way that went beyond just lack of sleep. Keith was driving, and he suddenly hit the brakes hard enough that I jerked forward. Bridget was sitting on our front porch with a huge bouquet of flowers and a giant stuffed bear next to her. She stood up when she saw our car, smiling like nothing had happened. Keith told me to stay in the car with Lily, and he got out, walking toward the porch with his shoulders tight. I rolled down my window so I could hear. Bridget started talking immediately, saying she was so glad Lily was okay, and she'd been worried sick all night. Keith cut her off and told her she needed to leave right now. Bridget's smile faded, and she said she just wanted to apologize and see that her niece was all right. Keith's voice was hard when he said she wasn't welcome here anymore and needed to go. Bridget started crying, tears running down her face as she said she'd never hurt Lily, and we were being so cruel. She said she loved that baby more than anything, and couldn't believe we were treating her like some kind of monster. Keith didn't move and told her again to leave. Bridget picked up the flowers and the bear and walked toward the car, trying to hand them through my window. I rolled it up quickly, and she stood there holding them, crying harder and saying we were breaking her heart over an accident. Keith told her again that she needed to leave our property right now. Bridget set the flowers and bear on the porch steps and crossed her arms over her chest. She said she had every right to see her niece and that I'd poisoned Keith against his own family. Her voice got louder, and she said she wasn't going anywhere until she saw Lily. Keith stepped in front of our door and told her one more time to go or he'd call the police. Bridget laughed like he was joking and said he wouldn't actually do that to his own sister. I rolled up the car window completely and pulled out my phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911 and told the operator that someone was refusing to leave our property after being asked multiple times. The operator asked if I felt threatened, and I looked at Bridget standing there with her arms crossed, blocking our path to our own front door. I said yes. Keith stood with his back against the door while Bridget kept talking at him, saying I was controlling him and turning him against everyone who loved him. She said she'd never hurt Lily, and that we were being cruel and heartless. The operator stayed on the line with me and said an officer was on the way. Bridget saw me on the phone through the car window, and her expression changed. She walked toward the car and knocked on the glass, asking what I was doing. I didn't answer, and she knocked harder, saying I better not be calling the police over this. Keith came down from the porch and got between Bridget and the car. He told her she needed to leave immediately before the police arrived. She said she wasn't scared of the police and that they'd see how crazy we were being. A police car pulled into our driveway about 8 minutes after my call. The officer got out and looked at all of us, then walked over to Keith and asked what was going on. Keith explained that his sister had been asked to leave multiple times and refused. Bridget interrupted and said she just wanted to see her niece, and that we were keeping her away for no reason. The officer asked for everyone's names and wrote them down in a small notebook. He asked Keith if Bridget lived here, and Keith said no. The officer asked Bridget if she'd been asked to leave, and she said yes, but that it wasn't fair. The officer looked at his notebook again and said something into his radio. He walked back to his car for a minute and then came back to where we were standing. He told Keith that this was the same address from yesterday's 911 call about a baby's fall. Keith nodded and said yes, that was correct. The officer asked if Bridget was involved in that incident, and Keith said she was the one who caused it. Bridget started talking fast, saying it was an accident and that she'd never deliberately hurt Lily. The officer held up his hand and told her to stop talking. He asked Keith to explain what happened yesterday. Keith told him about finding Lily on the floor after Bridget had taken her out of the crib and put her on the window seat next to an open window 2 stories up. The officer's expression got very serious. He asked if the hospital had been involved, and Keith said yes, that we'd spent the night there for observation. The officer wrote more notes and asked Bridget if that was accurate. She said it was an accident, and that the window thing was being blown out of proportion. The officer told Bridget that she was being given a formal trespass warning, which meant she was not allowed on this property anymore. He said if she came back, she could be arrested. Bridget's face got red, and she said this was ridiculous. The officer asked if she understood the warning, and she said yes, but that it wasn't right. He told her she needed to leave now, and she finally walked to her car. She got in and sat there for a minute before driving away. The officer gave Keith a copy of the report with a case number and said to call immediately if she came back. After he left, Keith and I sat in the car for a few minutes without saying anything. Lily was asleep in her car seat, and I didn't want to move and wake her up. Keith's phone started ringing. He looked at the screen and said it was his parents calling from Bridget's phone. He answered, and immediately his father's voice came through loud enough that I could hear it from the passenger seat. His father was yelling about how we'd called the police on family, and that we were tearing everyone apart. Keith tried to talk, but his father kept going, saying Bridget was devastated, and that we were treating her like a criminal over accidents. His mother got on the phone, and her voice was high and tight like she'd been crying. She said Bridget was sobbing and that we'd humiliated her in front of the neighbors. Keith finally got a word in and said that Bridget had refused to leave after being asked multiple times. His father said that didn't matter, that you don't call the police on family. Keith's voice stayed calm but firm when he said that Lily's safety came before anyone's feelings, including Bridget's. His mother asked how he could say that about his own sister, and Keith said because his sister had nearly let his daughter fall out a window yesterday. There was silence on the other end. His father said we were being dramatic and that Bridget would never have let anything happen to Lily. Keith asked if they'd seen the police report and the hospital records. His mother said those things were being taken out of context. Keith told them he had to go and ended the call. His phone immediately started ringing again, but he turned it off. We finally went inside and I put Lily in her crib. She didn't wake up during the transfer, and I stood there watching her breathe for a long time. Keith came up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. He said he was sorry for not seeing what was happening sooner. I didn't know what to say, so I just kept watching Lily sleep. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound made me jump, and I kept getting up to check on Lily even though she was fine. Keith found me standing in the nursery at 3 a.m. just staring at her crib. The next day was the same. I was exhausted but couldn't relax enough to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bridget's phone in camera mode and that open window. Keith noticed how jumpy I was and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, but he didn't believe me. The second night was worse. I fell asleep around midnight but woke up at 2 thinking I'd heard something downstairs. Keith went down to check and found nothing, but I couldn't go back to sleep after that. On the third day, Keith sat me down and said I needed to talk to someone about what we'd been through. I started to say I was handling it, but he stopped me and said I wasn't sleeping, and I was constantly on edge. He said his family had put both of us through hell by dismissing my concerns and making me think I was crazy. He said maybe talking to someone would help. I made an appointment with a therapist that afternoon. 3 days after the police came, I was home alone with Lily while Keith was at work. I heard a car door slam outside and looked out the window. Keith's mother was walking up to our front porch. My stomach dropped. She knocked on the door and called out that she knew I was home. I didn't move. She knocked again, harder this time, and said she just wanted to see her granddaughter. I walked to the window next to the door where she could see me, but I didn't open it. I told her through the glass that she needed to leave. She pressed her hands against the window and said she needed to talk to me. I said there was nothing to talk about. She said she was Lily's grandmother and had a right to see her. I told her she chose to defend someone who repeatedly put Lily in danger, and I couldn't trust her judgment anymore. Her face crumpled and she started crying. She sat down on the front step with her back against the door. Through the window, I could hear her saying she was sorry. She said she should have taken things more seriously, but that cutting off the whole family was extreme. I opened the window a crack and told her she staged an intervention to call me paranoid just hours before Bridget nearly let my baby fall out a window. She kept crying and said she didn't know it would get that bad. I said that was the problem, that she didn't want to see how bad it already was. I told her I needed space to figure out if she could ever be trusted again. She asked how long, and I said I didn't know. She sat there for another 10 minutes before finally getting in her car and leaving. I called Keith at work and told him what happened. He said he'd talk to his mother and make it clear she couldn't show up unannounced. That week, I had my appointment with Elena. Her office was in a small building near the hospital, and the waiting room had soft chairs and magazines nobody ever read. When she called my name, I followed her into her office and sat down. She asked what brought me in, and I started explaining about Bridget and the accidents in the window. I got about halfway through before I started crying and couldn't stop. Elena handed me tissues and waited. When I finally got control of myself, I finished the story. I told her about feeling isolated, being cut off from Keith's entire family, even though I knew it was necessary. Elena listened to everything and then said something that made me cry again. She said my maternal instincts had been correct all along. She said the family's response to my concerns was a form of emotional abuse called gaslighting, where they made me doubt my own perception of reality. She said protecting Lily didn't make me the villain, even though Keith's family was trying to cast me in that role. I went back the next week and Keith came with me. Elena asked him how he was doing and he said he felt guilty about not protecting us sooner. She asked him to explain, and he talked about how he'd been conditioned his whole life to excuse Bridget's behavior because of her fertility struggles. He said the family always centered everything around Bridget's pain, and he couldn't see past that to recognize how dangerous she'd become. Elena helped him understand that his guilt was normal, but that what mattered now was that he was choosing differently. 2 weeks after the window incident, I got an email from Bridget. The subject line said, "Please read this," and I almost deleted it without opening it. But I clicked on it. The email was long, maybe 8 paragraphs. She wrote about how much she loved Lily, and how her actions came from a place of love, not malice. She said she'd started seeing a therapist to work through her grief about not having children. She talked about how hard the past 7 years had been, and how seeing me get pregnant so easily had broken something in her. The whole email felt wrong. It focused on her pain and her struggles, not on the danger she'd created. There was no real acknowledgement that she'd almost let Lily fall out a window, or that she'd fed honey to a 2-month-old baby. It was more about making me understand her than about taking responsibility. I showed the email to Keith and he read it twice. He said it felt manipulative and I agreed. I brought the email to our next therapy session. Elena read it slowly while Keith and I sat there waiting. When she finished, she put it down on the coffee table between us and asked what we thought about it. Keith said it seemed like Bridget was trying, but something felt off. I said the whole thing made my skin crawl because she spent 8 paragraphs talking about her pain and maybe 2 sentences saying sorry. Elena nodded and explained that responding would be a mistake. She said Bridget had been told to stay away, and sending this email was itself a boundary violation. If we replied, it would teach Bridget that violating our boundaries gets her what she wants, which is contact and attention. Keith's face fell, and he said he felt terrible ignoring his sister when she was clearly suffering. Elena asked him if Bridget's suffering made Lily safer, and he sat there quiet for a long time before saying no. She told him that guilt was a normal feeling, but acting on it right now would put us back in the same pattern where Bridget's emotions mattered more than Lily's safety. Keith agreed not to respond, but I could see how much it cost him. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived in our mailbox. The return address was Keith's parents' house, and inside was a typed letter on nice paper. Keith's mother had written it, and his father had signed it too. The letter said they understood we were upset and needed space, but they were Lily's grandparents and wanted to be part of her life. They promised Bridget would not be present at any visits, and suggested we could meet at a park or restaurant where we'd feel comfortable. They said they'd been thinking about everything that happened and realized they should have listened to my concerns sooner. The letter ended by asking us to please consider letting them see their granddaughter under whatever conditions we felt were necessary. Keith read it twice and then handed it to me. I read it and felt torn in half. These were Lily's grandparents, and part of me wanted her to have that relationship. But they'd stood in our living room and called me paranoid while their daughter was upstairs putting my baby next to an open window. Keith asked what I thought, and I said I didn't know. We spent that whole evening going back and forth. They were family, and they seemed sorry, but their judgment had been so bad when it mattered most. We made an appointment with a lawyer the next week. His name was Garrett, and his office was in a building downtown with a waiting room that smelled like old carpet. When he called us back, Keith explained the whole situation while I held Lily. Garrett listened and took notes and asked questions about specific incidents. When Keith finished, Garrett leaned back in his chair and said that in our state, grandparents don't have automatic visitation rights. He explained that unless they could prove denying access would harm Lily, we were within our rights to limit or refuse contact. Keith looked relieved, but Garrett held up his hand and said that didn't mean they wouldn't try to fight it in court. He asked if we had documentation of everything that happened, and Keith said we had hospital records from the honey incident and the fall. Garrett said that was good, but we needed more. He told us to write down every dangerous incident with dates and times, every dismissive response from Keith's parents, every attempt at contact after we set boundaries. He said if this turned into a legal battle over grandparent visitation, we'd need a clear record showing why we limited access. The appointment cost $300, and we left feeling more worried than when we arrived. That night, after Lily was asleep, Keith sat at the computer composing an email to his parents. He must have started over 6 times. I watched him type and delete and type again. Finally, he had something he thought worked. The email said we appreciated their letter and their apology. It said we needed at least 3 months of no contact to heal and establish our family boundaries. It said after that time we'd consider supervised visits, but only if they acknowledged the seriousness of what happened and respected our parenting decisions going forward. Keith read it out loud to me and asked if it sounded okay. I said it sounded fair. He stared at the send button for a full minute before clicking it. His parents responded the next morning. The email was short and angry. His mother said Keith was abandoning his family, and that I'd clearly turned him against them. She said she'd never forgive us for keeping her granddaughter away, and that we were being cruel. His father's part was worse. He said if we didn't allow reasonable visitation, they'd have no choice but to pursue their legal rights as grandparents. Keith read the email at breakfast, and his hands were shaking. He showed it to me, and I felt my stomach drop. The threat was right there in writing. I called Garrett's office and left a message about the email. He called back that afternoon and said the threat actually helped our case because it showed they were more focused on their rights than on Lily's safety. But he said we needed to take the documentation seriously now. I spent the next week writing everything down. I started with the water bottle when Lily was 3 weeks old and worked forward through every incident I could remember. The blankets and stuffed animals in the crib, leaving her on the changing table, the improperly buckled car seat, the honey that sent us to the emergency room, the intervention where they called me paranoid, the open window. I included dates and times as best as I could remember them. Keith read what I'd written and added details I'd forgotten. We called both hospitals and requested copies of the records. The first hospital sent them within a few days. The second one said it would take 2 weeks. We put everything in a folder that got thicker every time we added to it. Then Bridget started showing up places. The first time was at the grocery store on a Tuesday morning. I was pushing the cart with Lily in her car seat, and I looked up and there was Bridget 3 aisles over. She was just standing there looking at us. When I saw her, I grabbed the cart and went straight to the checkout without getting half of what I needed. My hands shook so bad I could barely swipe my credit card. The second time was at Lily's pediatrician office for her checkup. I was sitting in the waiting room and Bridget walked past the window outside. She didn't come in, but she walked past 3 times during our appointment. I told the receptionist and she said there was nothing they could do about someone walking on a public sidewalk. The third time was at the park near our house. I'd taken Lily for a walk and stopped to sit on a bench. Bridget was sitting on a bench about 50 feet away. She didn't approach us or say anything, but she was watching. I picked up Lily and walked home fast, looking over my shoulder the whole way. Keith called Bridget that night. I could hear him from the other room even though I couldn't make out the words. His voice was loud and angry. When he came back, he said he'd told her that what she was doing was stalking and we'd get a restraining order if it continued. He said she acted innocent and claimed she had a right to shop at the same stores and visit the same places we did. Technically, she was right. She wasn't breaking any laws by existing in public spaces. But it was so clearly intentional. She knew where we'd be and she made sure we saw her. After that, I started having panic attacks every time I needed to leave the house with Lily. My chest would get tight and I couldn't breathe right. I'd imagine Bridget showing up wherever we were going. I'd picture her trying to take Lily or cause another accident. Keith had to come with me to the grocery store because I couldn't do it alone anymore. At my next appointment, Elena taught me some breathing exercises to use when the panic started. She had me practice noticing 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. It helped a little, but not enough. We made a safety plan for different scenarios. If Bridget approached us in public, I'd walk away immediately and call Keith. If she tried to touch Lily, I'd yell for help and call the police. If she followed us, I'd drive to the police station instead of going home. Having plans made me feel slightly more in control, but I still felt scared every single time I left the house. Keith called his boss that afternoon and explained everything. He said he needed family leave to help me through a rough time and to protect our baby from a dangerous situation. His employer approved 2 weeks immediately. Keith hung up and told me he was staying home to make sure I felt safe, and to be ready if his family tried anything else. The next morning, we sat at the kitchen table with Lily sleeping in her bassinet between us. Keith said we needed to change our routines so Bridget couldn't predict where we'd be. I made a list on a notepad. We'd shop at the grocery store across town instead of our usual one. We'd go to the park in a different neighborhood. We'd vary what time we left the house each day. We'd only tell my best friend and my mom our actual plans. Keith added that we should use different routes when we drove places and park in different spots. It felt extreme, like we were hiding from a stalker. But that's basically what Bridget had become. We were hiding from his own sister because she'd shown up everywhere we went, watching us from a distance with that blank expression on her face. Keith reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said he was sorry it had come to this, but Lily's safety was more important than feeling normal. We tested our new system that week. Keith drove us to a grocery store 20 minutes away that we'd never been to before. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time we shopped, expecting to see Bridget appear at the end of an aisle. She didn't show up. We went to a park on the other side of town, and I actually relaxed enough to push Lily on the baby swings. No Bridget watching from a bench. We drove home using a longer route that took us through neighborhoods we didn't normally pass through. I started breathing easier. Maybe the unpredictability was working. Maybe she couldn't find us if she didn't know where we'd be. On Thursday afternoon, Garrett called and said he'd received a strange request. Bridget's therapist had contacted him asking if we'd participate in a joint family therapy session to work toward reconciliation. The therapist said Bridget was making progress in dealing with her infertility grief and wanted to repair the relationship with us. Garrett's voice got serious when he told me his advice. He said we had absolutely no obligation to participate in Bridget's therapy. He said these joint sessions could be used to manipulate us into dropping our boundaries. He said therapists sometimes pushed for reconciliation without fully understanding the danger involved. He told me to decline the request and not feel guilty about it. I thanked him and hung up. When Keith got home from picking up takeout, I told him about the call. He looked tired and sad, but he agreed with Garrett. We weren't going to help Bridget feel better about what she'd done. We were protecting our daughter, not managing his sister's emotions. The next week, Keith's phone started blowing up with messages from extended family. His cousin sent a long text calling us vindictive and saying we were punishing Bridget for something that wasn't entirely her fault. His uncle left a voicemail saying we needed to be more forgiving. Keith's phone buzzed constantly with opinions from relatives who hadn't even been there for any of the incidents. But then Keith's aunt called, the one who'd always been quiet at family gatherings. She said she wanted to talk to both of us, so Keith put her on speaker. His aunt said she'd watched Bridget's behavior with Lily from the beginning, and it had made her uncomfortable. She said Bridget's obsession with being Lily's second mother had seemed unhealthy even before the dangerous incidents. She said she supported our decision completely and thought we were doing the right thing by protecting our daughter. She apologized for not speaking up sooner when she'd noticed something was off. After we hung up, I cried with relief. At least one person in Keith's family understood. At least we weren't completely alone in this. 3 months passed. The constant vigilance became our new normal. We kept varying our routines and Bridget stopped appearing in public places. Maybe she'd given up, or maybe our unpredictability actually worked. Lily had her 4-month checkup on a Tuesday morning. The pediatrician came in and immediately commented on how different I seemed. She said I looked more relaxed and less anxious than at previous appointments. I explained that we'd cut off contact with the family member who'd been causing the dangerous situations. The doctor nodded and said she could see the positive difference in both Lily and me. She said Lily seemed calmer too, picking up on my reduced stress levels. She checked Lily thoroughly and said she was developing perfectly. As we left the office, I realized the doctor was right. I did feel different. The constant panic attacks had faded. I could take Lily places without my chest getting tight. I still looked over my shoulder, but I wasn't consumed by fear anymore. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail addressed to both Keith and me. The return address was Keith's parents' house. I opened it at the kitchen table while Keith was giving Lily a bottle. Inside was a 2-page letter written in his mother's handwriting. I read it out loud to Keith. His parents said they'd had time to think about everything that happened. They acknowledged they should have taken the safety concerns more seriously. They said they understood now that the pattern of incidents was dangerous. But then the letter shifted. They called each incident a mistake rather than part of a deliberate pattern. They said Bridget had made errors in judgment, not intentional choices to endanger Lily. The final paragraph asked for immediate reinstatement of grandparent visits. They wanted to see Lily regularly again, starting as soon as possible. I put the letter down and looked at Keith. He was staring at the paper with his jaw clenched. He said the apology was a start, but they still didn't get it. They still thought Bridget had just been careless instead of dangerous. They still weren't fully accepting what had happened. I called Elena and read her the letter during my next session. She helped me figure out exactly what to say in response. We spent 40 minutes crafting careful sentences that acknowledged the apology but set clear conditions. Elena said we needed to outline specific boundaries and consequences if those boundaries got crossed. We wrote that we appreciated them recognizing they should have listened to us sooner. We wrote that we needed to see sustained respect for our parenting decisions before we could consider visits. Then we listed the conditions. No discussion of Bridget during visits. No attempts to minimize what happened or call the incidents mistakes. No surprise visits at our house. All meetings scheduled in advance at public places only. Elena said to be specific, so there was no room for misunderstanding. Keith typed up the response that night and sent it by email so we'd have a record of exactly what we'd said. Keith's mother replied the next morning. Her email said she agreed to our terms, but I could feel the resentment in how she wrote. She said she understood we needed time, but implied we were being too harsh. She said she'd follow our rules even though she thought they were excessive. She agreed to meet at a family restaurant the following week. She ended the email by saying she hoped we'd eventually see that they only wanted what was best for Lily. I forwarded the email to Elena and asked if the tone bothered her too. Elena called me back within an hour. She said the email showed Keith's mother was agreeing to our boundaries while still believing we were wrong to set them. She said to proceed with the visit, but be ready to leave immediately if the boundaries got crossed. She reminded me that we were doing this for Lily's relationship with her grandparents, not to make Keith's parents feel better. The restaurant visit happened on Saturday afternoon. Keith's parents were already sitting in a booth when we arrived with Lily in her car seat. They stood up when they saw us, and Keith's mother's eyes went straight to Lily. She said Lily had gotten so big and asked if she could hold her. I said yes, and watched carefully as she took Lily from the car seat. She was gentle and loving, cooing at Lily and kissing her forehead. Keith's father asked about Lily's sleep schedule and her feeding routine. They were trying hard to follow the rules, asking permission before doing anything, keeping the conversation focused on Lily. But the whole interaction felt stiff and awkward. Keith's parents were walking on eggshells, choosing every word carefully. I could feel their resentment under the polite questions. About 20 minutes into the visit, Keith's mother was bouncing Lily on her knee and said how much Bridget would love to see how big Lily was getting. The words just slipped out, like she couldn't help herself. I put down my water glass and looked directly at Keith's mother. I reminded her that discussing Bridget was off limits. That was one of the specific conditions we'd set. Keith's mother's face flushed red and she apologized quickly. But then she added that it was hard to pretend her daughter didn't exist. She said Bridget was still part of the family even if we couldn't see that right now. I felt the familiar frustration rising in my chest. They still didn't understand. They thought we were punishing Bridget or holding a grudge. They couldn't see that this was about keeping Lily safe from someone who'd repeatedly put her in danger. Keith reached under the table and put his hand on my leg, a signal that he'd handle this. He told his mother that we weren't asking her to pretend Bridget didn't exist. We were asking her not to talk about Bridget during the limited time we were allowing them with Lily. He said if she couldn't follow that one simple rule, we'd have to leave and try again another time. His mother pressed her lips together and nodded. She handed Lily back to me and said she understood, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't really understand at all. The rest of the drive home was quiet. Keith kept his hands tight on the wheel, and I watched the streetlights blur past while Lily slept in her car seat. When we got inside, Keith put Lily down in her crib, and we stood in the hallway between her nursery and our bedroom. He asked me what I thought, and I told him the truth. His parents were trying, but they didn't really get it. They thought we were punishing them, and they were being patient with us until we got over it. Keith ran his hand through his hair and said he'd noticed the same thing. His mother had been careful with her words, but he could feel her thinking we were being too harsh. I asked him if he wanted to keep trying with them, and he said yes. We couldn't just cut off his whole family forever, but we had to watch them carefully and be ready to walk away again if they crossed the line. I agreed, and we decided to schedule another visit in 2 weeks at the same restaurant. The second visit started okay. Keith's parents arrived on time, and his mother immediately asked to hold Lily. I passed her over and watched as his mother bounced Lily on her knee and made silly faces. Keith's father asked about Lily's new skills, and I told him she was starting to grab things and roll over. We ordered lunch and talked about safe topics like the weather and a movie Keith's father had seen. Then Keith's mother reached into her purse and pulled out a wrapped gift box. She set it on the table between us and said it was from someone who loved Lily very much. I looked at Keith and he looked at the box. His father said they knew we had rules, but this was just a small toy and some clothes. Nothing dangerous. Keith asked who the gift was from, even though we both already knew. His mother said it was from his sister who missed her niece terribly. I felt my chest get tight and told them we couldn't accept gifts from her. That was part of our no-contact boundary. Keith's mother's face fell and she said it was just a present. She said his sister just wanted to show love for Lily, and we were being cruel by rejecting everything from her. Keith picked up the box and handed it back to his mother. He explained slowly that accepting gifts from his sister meant his parents were acting as go-betweens. That violated the boundary we'd set. His mother pushed the box back across the table and said we were being ridiculous. She said his sister had spent time picking out things Lily would like, and we should at least open it. I stood up and started packing Lily's diaper bag. Keith told his parents they couldn't use visits with Lily to push his sister back into our lives. His father said we were overreacting to a simple gift. He said families give each other presents and we were making everything into a huge problem. Keith stood up too and said the huge problem was that his sister had nearly killed our daughter multiple times. He said until his parents could acknowledge that reality without calling it mistakes or accidents, we couldn't trust their judgment about what was safe for Lily. His mother started crying and said we were being so unforgiving. She said his sister made some errors, but she loved Lily, and we were holding a grudge. Keith's father leaned forward and said we needed to let go of our anger. He said forgiveness meant moving past what happened and giving people second chances. Keith put his hand on my back and said, forgiveness didn't mean giving someone continued access to the child they'd harmed. He said protecting Lily wasn't about grudges or anger. It was about basic safety and the fact that his sister had shown she couldn't be trusted around our baby. His father's face turned red and he said we were being self-righteous. He said everyone makes mistakes with babies and we were acting like his daughter was some kind of monster. Keith said his sister had fed honey to a 2-month-old and left her next to an open window. Those weren't mistakes. Those were dangerous choices that could have killed Lily. I picked up Lily from his mother's lap and put her in her car seat. His mother grabbed my arm and said we couldn't leave. She said they'd followed all our rules and we were punishing them for trying to help his sister. I pulled my arm away and told her that bringing gifts from his sister wasn't following our rules. It was testing our boundaries to see what they could get away with. Keith picked up the car seat and we walked toward the restaurant exit. His mother followed us, calling out that we were using Lily as a weapon. She said we were punishing the whole family and keeping her granddaughter away to hurt them. Keith stopped at the door and turned around. He told his mother that this was about protection, not punishment. He said if she couldn't understand the difference, then we needed another break from contact. His father stood up and said we were making a huge mistake. He said we'd regret cutting off family over our pride. Keith said keeping Lily safe was never something we'd regret, and we walked out to the parking lot. We drove home in silence again. Keith's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could see tears on his face. When we got inside, he sat on the couch with his head in his hands. I put Lily in her bouncer and sat next to him. He said he couldn't believe his parents still didn't get it. After everything that happened, they still thought we were being too harsh on his sister. I put my hand on his knee and said some people would never fully understand. Keith said he'd thought if we gave them time and set clear boundaries, they'd eventually see why we had to protect Lily. But they were never going to choose our daughter's safety over his sister's feelings. He said he didn't know if he could keep trying with them. I told him we didn't have to decide anything right now. We could take another break and see how we felt in a few weeks. Keith nodded and wiped his eyes. He said he needed to email them and tell them we were taking space again. I said I'd help him write it. I called Elena the next morning and asked if she had any openings that week. She fit us in 2 days later, and Keith and I sat in her office while Lily played on a blanket on the floor. Elena asked how the visits with Keith's parents had gone, and I told her about the gifts from his sister. Keith explained how his parents had defended bringing them, and how the whole visit had fallen apart. Elena nodded and said she wasn't surprised. She said some family members never fully accept responsibility for enabling harmful behavior. They might acknowledge that something bad happened, but they'll always minimize it or spread the blame around. Keith asked if his parents would ever really understand why we had to keep his sister away from Lily. Elena said maybe, and maybe not. She said the important thing was that we couldn't wait for them to understand before we protected our daughter. We had to accept that we might never have the close relationship with his parents that we'd hoped for. Keith's voice cracked when he said that was hard to accept. Elena said of course it was hard. He was grieving the loss of family relationships he'd thought he'd have. He'd imagined his parents being involved grandparents and his sister being a loving aunt. Instead, he was choosing between his daughter's safety and his extended family. That was a terrible position to be in, and it was okay to feel sad about it. Keith talked about how he'd always pictured Lily growing up close to his parents. He'd imagined Sunday dinners and holidays and his parents babysitting while we went on date nights. He said he felt guilty that Lily wouldn't know her grandparents the way he'd known his. Elena leaned forward and said Keith was building something important, even if it didn't look like what he'd imagined. He was creating a new family culture based on safety and healthy boundaries. He was teaching Lily that her parents would always protect her even when it cost them relationships they valued. That was a gift even if it meant losing toxic extended family connections. She said Lily would grow up knowing her parents put her first, and that was more valuable than having grandparents who enabled dangerous behavior. Keith nodded slowly and said he'd never thought about it that way. Elena said grief and doing the right thing could exist at the same time. He could feel sad about losing his family while also knowing he was making the only choice that kept Lily safe. 5 months passed. We settled into a routine without Keith's parents or his sister. Lily was 7 months old and starting to sit up on her own. Keith and I had found a rhythm as parents, and I wasn't having panic attacks anymore when we left the house. Then a letter arrived from a law office I didn't recognize. I opened it standing at the mailbox and felt my stomach drop. It was a cease and desist letter on behalf of his sister claiming we were defaming her. The letter said we'd been telling people she'd endangered Lily, and that these false statements were damaging her reputation. It demanded we stop making these claims immediately or face legal action. I walked inside and handed the letter to Keith. He read it twice and then called Garrett. We met with him the next afternoon and he read through the letter carefully. He said it was baseless because we'd only shared truthful information with medical professionals and immediate family. Truth was a complete defense against defamation. But he said the letter showed his sister's continued refusal to accept responsibility for what she'd done. Instead of acknowledging her dangerous behavior, she was trying to silence us legally. Garrett said the legal threat might actually backfire on her. He explained that responding to it would require him to prepare formal documentation of everything that happened. He'd gather all the hospital records from the honey incident and the fall. He'd get statements from the doctors who treated Lily. He'd document every dangerous incident with dates and details. He said if she actually pursued a defamation case, we'd use all this evidence in court. That would create a permanent public record of her actions that anyone could access. It would be much worse for her reputation than anything we'd said privately to family. Keith asked if we should be worried about her filing an actual lawsuit. Garrett said probably not once her lawyer saw the evidence we had. Most lawyers wouldn't take a defamation case when the defendant could prove everything they said was true. He said he'd send a response letter outlining the documented pattern of child endangerment and noting that any further legal action would result in us pursuing a restraining order. Garrett spent the next week pulling together everything we had. He got copies of the emergency room records from both hospital visits. He got statements from the doctors who treated Lily. He compiled my written accounts of each incident with specific dates and details. He organized all the text messages and emails from Keith's family. When he finished, he had a folder 2 inches thick documenting his sister's dangerous behavior. He drafted a response letter to her lawyer that was 4 pages long. It listed every incident in clinical detail. It included references to the medical records and doctor statements. It explained that we'd shared truthful information about actual events, and that truth was a complete defense to defamation. The letter ended by noting that if she pursued any further legal action, we would seek a restraining order and use all this documentation to support it. Garrett sent the letter, and we waited. 2 weeks went by, and we heard nothing. Then 3 weeks. Garrett said the silence suggested her lawyer had advised her to drop it. He said any competent attorney would look at our evidence and tell her she had no case. More importantly, they'd tell her that pursuing it would only create the public record of her actions that she was trying to prevent. A week after Garrett sent his response to her lawyer, Keith got a call from his aunt who'd been at the hospital the day Lily was born. She asked if we could meet for coffee and said it was important. Keith went alone while I stayed home with Lily. He came back 2 hours later looking exhausted but also relieved. His aunt had heard from multiple family members that Bridget was telling everyone a completely different story about what happened. In her version, we were cruel parents who wouldn't let her see her niece because of minor disagreements about parenting styles. She was painting herself as the victim of our overprotective paranoia. His aunt said she knew something was wrong with that story because she'd seen how Bridget acted at the hospital when Lily was born. The way she'd tried to hold Lily before I even got to. The way she'd talked about being Lily's second mother. She said she should have said something then but didn't want to cause family drama. Now she was asking what really happened because the pieces weren't adding up. Keith told her everything. Every dangerous incident. Every time we'd tried to address it. Every time his parents had defended Bridget. He showed her the hospital records from both emergency room visits. He showed her the documentation Garrett had compiled. His aunt sat there with tears running down her face, saying she was so sorry she hadn't spoken up sooner. She said half the family believed Bridget's version, and the other half suspected there was more to the story, but nobody knew the truth. Keith asked if she thought we should try to set the record straight with other family members. She said yes, that people deserve to know what really happened so they could make informed decisions about their relationships with everyone involved. Over the next 2 weeks, Keith and I had careful conversations with a few family members we trusted. His aunt and uncle came to our house and we showed them everything. The timeline of incidents, the medical records, the statements from doctors, the texts from his parents defending Bridget. His uncle kept shaking his head saying he knew Bridget had been struggling with her infertility, but he never imagined it had affected her judgment this badly. They both apologized for not checking in with us sooner, for assuming everything was fine when we'd stopped coming to family gatherings. Keith's cousin came over separately, and her reaction was different. She said she'd always thought Bridget was too intense about wanting to be involved with Lily. She remembered Bridget making comments during my pregnancy about how she'd be the one to teach Lily everything important, how she'd have a special bond with her that nobody else would understand. His cousin had thought it was weird at the time, but figured Bridget was just excited about being an aunt. When we showed her what had actually happened, she got angry. Not at us, at Bridget, and at Keith's parents for enabling her. She said her own kids were older now, but she'd never let Bridget babysit them again after hearing this. We also talked to Keith's uncle on his mother's side, a retired pediatrician who'd always been kind to me. He reviewed the medical documentation and said the pattern was clear and deeply concerning. He said Bridget's actions went beyond ignorance or outdated information. The honey incident alone should have been a massive wake-up call for the whole family. He said he'd try to talk some sense into Keith's parents, but he wasn't optimistic they'd listen. The reactions from family members ranged from shock to validation. Some of them admitted they'd sensed something was wrong with how Bridget acted around Lily, but hadn't known how bad it was. Others were horrified that Keith's parents had staged an intervention calling me paranoid instead of protecting their granddaughter. A few said they'd noticed Bridget becoming more obsessive and isolated over the years of fertility treatments, but nobody had known how to help her. Keith's cousin offered to host family gatherings at her house that would specifically exclude Bridget and Keith's parents. She said she wanted her kids to know Lily, and she wanted us to still feel connected to the family members who understood what we'd been through. She said Keith's parents had made their choice to prioritize Bridget over everyone else's safety and comfort, and that choice had consequences. Other family members agreed. Within a month, there was a clear split in Keith's extended family between people who believed us and supported our boundaries, and people who either believed Bridget's version or didn't want to get involved. Having even some family members understand our position made a huge difference for Keith. He'd been feeling like he'd lost his entire family by choosing to protect Lily. Now he realized he'd lost the toxic parts of his family but kept the healthy relationships. His aunt told him that sometimes families need to fracture along the fault lines that were always there, and that what happened with Bridget just revealed problems that had existed for years. 6 months after the window incident, Keith's cousin hosted a birthday party for her oldest daughter. She made it clear in the invitation that Bridget and Keith's parents were not invited, and that this was a safe space for everyone else. We decided to go because Lily was 7 months old now, and we wanted her to know her extended family. Walking into that party was strange. There were probably 20 people there, all related to Keith in various ways, and none of them were his immediate family. His aunt rushed over the second we arrived and asked to hold Lily. I felt my whole body tense up, but Keith squeezed my hand and nodded. His aunt held Lily carefully, supporting her head and talking to her softly. She didn't try to take her away from us or disappear into another room. After a few minutes, she handed Lily back and said she was beautiful and clearly thriving. Other family members came over throughout the afternoon to meet Lily. They were respectful, asking before touching her, commenting on how alert and happy she seemed. Nobody pressured us about reconciling with Bridget or Keith's parents. Nobody suggested we were overreacting or being too careful. It was the first family gathering we'd been to since Lily was born, where I didn't spend the whole time in fight-or-flight mode. Keith's cousin pulled me aside at one point and said she was glad we came. She said she'd been worried we'd feel too uncomfortable to maintain any family connections, and she wanted us to know that we had family who cared about us and respected our decisions. I realized I was crying, and she hugged me and said it was okay, that we'd been through something traumatic, and we were allowed to still be processing it. Later in the afternoon, Keith's grandmother showed up. I hadn't known she was coming, and I felt myself tense up again. She'd been at the intervention, sitting quietly while her daughter and son-in-law attacked me. She'd never called afterward to apologize or check on Lily, but she walked straight over to Keith and asked if they could talk privately. They went out to the backyard and were gone for almost 20 minutes. When they came back, Keith's eyes were red and his grandmother's were too. She came over to where I was sitting with Lily and asked if she could sit down. I said yes, and she sat next to me and looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she turned to me and apologized. She said she'd noticed Bridget's behavior from the very beginning, the way she'd tried to take over at the hospital, the way she'd talked about Lily like she was her own baby. She said she'd had a bad feeling about it, but she didn't speak up because she didn't want to cause family drama. She said when I'd raised concerns about the unsafe sleep practices and the other incidents, she'd thought I might be right, but again, she stayed quiet. Then when the intervention happened, she sat there and let her daughter call me paranoid when she knew in her gut that something was very wrong with how Bridget was acting. She said she'd been a coward, and that her silence had almost cost Lily her life. She said she regretted it every single day, and she understood if I never forgave her. She asked if there was any way she could have a relationship with Lily separate from Keith's parents, and she promised she would never mention Bridget or push for reconciliation. Keith told me later what his grandmother had said to him in the backyard. She'd told him that his mother had always enabled Bridget's worst behaviors because she felt guilty about Bridget's infertility. His mother had 3 kids easily, and Bridget couldn't have any, and his mother had spent years trying to make up for that by letting Bridget have whatever she wanted. When Bridget became obsessed with Lily, his mother couldn't see it as dangerous because she was too busy trying to help Bridget fill the void of not having her own child. His grandmother said she'd tried to talk to her daughter about it, but his mother wouldn't listen. She said the family had been conflict avoidant for generations, and that pattern had enabled Bridget's behavior to escalate to the point where a baby almost died. She said Keith was breaking that pattern by choosing his daughter's safety over family peace, and she was proud of him even though it meant fracturing the family. She said she wanted to be part of the new family dynamic he was building, one based on healthy boundaries instead of enabling dangerous behavior. Keith had cried and told her he appreciated her apology and her honesty. We agreed that his grandmother could have supervised visits with Lily. She came over the following week and sat with us for an hour, holding Lily and playing with her while we watched. She didn't try to take over or give unwanted advice. She just enjoyed her great-granddaughter and respected our space. When she left, she thanked us for giving her a chance and said she'd do whatever it took to rebuild our trust. I'd been seeing Elena for 7 months at that point, and the therapy was helping. I was finally able to leave the house with Lily without having constant panic attacks. I still checked and rechecked her car seat straps, and I still woke up multiple times a night to make sure she was breathing, but the sharp terror that had lived in my chest for months was starting to fade. Elena helped me understand that what I'd been through was trauma. Having my maternal instincts dismissed repeatedly, watching my baby be endangered over and over while people told me I was paranoid, nearly losing her to a 2-story fall, all of it had left marks. She said healing didn't mean going back to who I was before. It meant learning to live with what happened and trust myself again. I told her I didn't think I'd ever be the carefree mother I'd imagined being before Lily was born. She said that was okay, that being vigilant about my daughter's safety wasn't a character flaw. The difference now was that I could take Lily to the park or the store without feeling like danger was lurking everywhere. I could let trusted family members hold her without hovering. I could put her down for a nap without checking on her every 5 minutes. I was learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and trauma response, and that distinction was giving me my life back slowly. Keith and I were different as a couple, too. We'd been through something that could have destroyed our marriage, and for a while I'd thought it might. But he'd proven through his actions over the past 7 months that he would choose Lily's safety over family harmony every single time. He'd cut off his parents and his sister. He'd gotten a lawyer. He'd stood up to his whole family at the hospital, and again at every attempt they'd made to boundary stomp. He'd gone to therapy with me and worked through his guilt about not protecting us sooner. He'd rebuilt my trust in him piece by showing me that he understood why I'd felt so alone and dismissed in those early months. We had a rule now that if I said something felt unsafe with Lily, we stopped and talked about it immediately. No dismissing, no explaining away, no prioritizing other people's feelings over my concerns. He'd learned that my instincts about our daughter were right, and he would never question them again just to keep peace with people who'd proven they didn't deserve his loyalty. We were stronger because we'd learned what mattered most, and we'd chosen it together even when it cost us everything else. We settled into a new normal over the following months. We had limited contact with Keith's parents through occasional supervised visits that stayed somewhat distant but civil. We had close relationships with extended family members who respected our boundaries, like Keith's aunt and uncle, his cousin, and his grandmother. We had complete no contact with Bridget, and we'd blocked her on everything. It wasn't the family dynamic we'd imagined when we got married or when Lily was born. Keith had pictured big family gatherings with his parents doting on their granddaughter and his sister being the fun aunt. I'd pictured having help and support from in-laws who loved us. Instead, we had a smaller circle of people we could trust, clear boundaries that everyone respected, and the peace of knowing our daughter was safe. Elena said sometimes the family you build is healthier than the family you're born into, and that's what we'd done. We'd built a family structure around safety and respect instead of obligation and guilt. Keith's parents slowly started to accept that they wouldn't have the grandmother relationship they'd wanted unless they fully respected our parenting decisions. They stopped bringing up Bridget at visits. They stopped suggesting we were being too harsh, or that enough time had passed for reconciliation. They followed our rules about supervised visits, and they didn't show up unannounced anymore. The relationship was distant, and it probably always would be, but it was civil. Keith's mother still looked at me sometimes with resentment in her eyes, like I was the one who'd ruined everything. But she kept it to herself because she knew that pushing back would mean losing access to Lily completely. Keith's father mostly stayed quiet during visits, playing with Lily but not engaging much with us. It was sad in a way, seeing what could have been a warm grandparent relationship reduced to awkward supervised visits. But it was the natural consequence of their choices to defend someone who'd endangered their granddaughter over and over. I heard through Keith's grandmother about 2 months later that Bridget had moved to Arizona. She called Keith one afternoon while he was playing with Lily on the living room floor. She said Bridget had packed up and left without telling most of the family, just sent her parents a text saying she needed a fresh start somewhere else. Keith hung up the phone and looked at me with this mix of relief and sadness on his face. Part of him was glad she was far away where she couldn't show up at the grocery store or drive past our house. Part of him mourned the sister he thought he had before all this happened. I felt mostly relief. The physical distance meant I could breathe easier when I took Lily out. But we didn't change our boundaries just because Bridget moved across the country. Geography didn't fix what was broken in her or erase what she'd done. She could move to Alaska, and it wouldn't change the fact that she'd repeatedly put my daughter in danger. The no-contact rule stayed in place because distance doesn't heal someone who refuses to see they were wrong. Lily's first birthday approached faster than I expected. I'd spent so many of those early months in survival mode, just trying to keep her safe and get through each day. Now she was almost walking, babbling constantly, and had this huge smile that lit up her whole face. I looked at her one morning while she ate breakfast and realized how different everything felt. I trusted my gut completely now. When something felt wrong with Lily, I acted on it immediately without second-guessing myself or worrying about seeming paranoid. I'd built a circle of people around us who respected our rules and understood why they existed. Keith's aunt checked in regularly. His cousin invited us to family things that felt safe. Elena had become more than just our therapist. She was someone I could call when I needed to talk through hard decisions. I'd learned the most important lesson of all, that protecting my child mattered more than keeping peace with people who wouldn't protect her too. Some relationships cost too much to maintain. Losing Keith's parents as active grandparents hurt. Losing his sister as family hurt. But keeping Lily safe was worth every single loss. We planned Lily's birthday party at our house with the people who'd supported us through everything. Keith's aunt and uncle came early to help set up decorations. His cousin brought his kids who were gentle with Lily and followed all our safety rules. Elena arrived with a gift wrapped in bright paper covered in butterflies. Our close friends who'd listened to me cry and rage during the worst months showed up with food and love. Keith's parents called that morning asking if they could come. Keith told them they could stop by for an hour, but that was it. They arrived right on time, looking uncomfortable and out of place among people who genuinely celebrated with us instead of judging us. Keith's mother held Lily for a few minutes and sang happy birthday with everyone else. His father took some photos. But they left before we cut the cake, saying they had other plans. Their early exit stung less than I thought it would. I'd expected to feel sad or angry watching them leave. Instead, I felt okay. We had a whole room full of people who loved Lily and respected us as her parents. I watched Lily sit in her high chair with her smash cake in front of her. She looked at it for a second like she wasn't sure what to do. Then she grabbed a handful and squeezed it between her fingers, laughing as frosting went everywhere. Everyone gathered around taking pictures and cheering her on. She was covered in blue frosting, grinning at all the attention, completely safe and happy. I looked around at Keith's aunt showing Lily how to smash the cake harder, at his cousin's kids singing to her, at Elena smiling from across the room, at Keith standing next to me with his hand on my back. These people would never deliberately put Lily in danger. They would never dismiss my concerns or tell me I was being paranoid. They would never choose someone else's feelings over my daughter's safety. The fracture with Keith's family left scars I'd probably carry forever. I was more careful now, more cautious about who I trusted around Lily. I still had moments where I checked on her sleeping just to make sure she was breathing. But my daughter was safe. She was thriving. She was surrounded by people who would protect her the way she deserved. That was what mattered most. Everything else, all the pain and loss and family drama, was worth it for this moment right here.